At any given time, the US Navy is legally mandated to have at least 11 aircraft carriers in operation. On the day this video is uploaded, most of those carriers are either docked or sailing just off the coast of the US mainland, at least according to public data. For obvious reasons, completely up-to-date information on their exact location is not shared, but these 1,000-foot floating warships are also not exactly subtle, and in modern times, that's been part of their appeal. 2 of the 3 carriers currently sailing outside of US waters are in strategic locations adjacent to the South China Sea, and the 3rd is located intimidatingly close to the coast of Venezuela. Even if they never see active combat, they do send a certain message. However, regardless of their current location or mission, every single one of these carriers all started life in exactly the same dry dock. On the 22nd of July 2017, the USS Gerald R. Ford was officially commissioned at the Newport News shipyard in Virginia, becoming the latest carrier to enter the fleet, the largest warship ever constructed, and, coincidentally, the most expensive as well. The raw volume of steel, the man-hours, and cutting-edge technologies that went into this ship certainly contributed to that price. But one of the biggest factors of all was simply the time it took to get this vessel from the drawing board to the ocean. The first steel plates on the vessel were cut back in 2005, and even after the keys were handed over to the Navy in 2017, it took an additional 5 years before it went on its first deployment in 2023. For almost 20 years straight, this ship was worked on around the clock by as many as 10,000 on-site tradesmen, technicians, engineers, and government auditors. This process actually went on for so long that the company that eventually delivered the ship technically didn't even exist when construction began. This shipyard in Virginia is currently the only facility in the world authorized and capable of building US supercarriers. In 2005, when construction started, this facility was owned and operated by Northrop Grumman Shipbuilding, but in 2011, 6 years in, the shipbuilding part of the company was spun off and established as its own business, Huntington Ingalls Industry. The reason for that corporate breakup will become very clear, but the important point for now is that this company owns the single shipyard that has an effective monopoly on constructing these carriers. The shipyard itself is also only one piece of the literal construction puzzle. Everything from the Bechtel nuclear reactors to the evac jet's vacuum toilet system was supplied by a collection of over 2,000 contractors, subcontractors, and sub-subcontractors. This web of suppliers has simultaneously become so important and well organized that they formed what amounts to their own union. According to their own website, the Aircraft Carrier Industrial Base Coalition represents the businesses that supply parts, equipment, and services for the construction and maintenance of US naval aircraft carriers. This organization exists to lobby on behalf of all these military contractors to make sure business remains steady, and they're not shy about highlighting that these companies directly employ over 60,000 people in 44 states. Now, I know what you're thinking: military contractors, lobbying politicians, and not so subtly threatening thousands of job losses if things don't go their way? That's not exactly shocking, is it? But the thing is, in this case, it's also completely unnecessary. The mandate to have 11 operational carriers does not come from the Navy itself. It was actually passed into law back in 2006 through the National Defense Authorization Act. The original law actually called for no less than 12 carriers, but it was reviewed down a year later to just 11 carriers as something of a compromise between budget constraints and operational capabilities. Now, regardless of the exact number, this creates a logical economic problem that you might be starting to notice. If price is a function of supply and demand, then, on the supply side, the US has one single supplier that has a monopoly on building these vessels, and on the demand side, there's a legal mandate that the Navy must keep a set amount of these ships in operation. It's seemingly the perfect storm to price gouge the taxpayers, right? Well, the official line for the Department of Defense, the contractors, and the lawmakers is that these strange market dynamics are actually working as intended. The complete absence of competition is a feature and not a bug. But the US Navy is not the only fish in the sea, and the quirkiness of carrier economics is best appreciated by the runner-up, which is trying to achieve the same thing, but doing it in almost exactly the opposite way. This video is sponsored by Storyblocks. If you're a content creator, having good stock footage is a must, and we use Storyblocks to improve our storytelling with an authentic stock library created by artists. There's such a massive library of video clips, images, music, and sound effects that we can always find whatever we need to make our videos pop really quickly, which speeds up our workflow so we can put out more videos for you guys. All the video licensing is super clear, so we can rest without having to worry about YouTube copyright claims. And what I love is that it's totally unlimited, so we can download tons of great 4K footage, with new clips being added all the time, test them out in our timeline, and then switch it for something else if we change our mind. We honestly couldn't do what we do without it. So if you're ready to get started with unlimited stock media downloads at one set price, head to storyblocks.com/micro or click the link in the description. Once they're built, aircraft carriers are expected to stay in service for a very long time. The USS Nimitz is the lead ship of the Nimitz class of carriers. The 9 other carriers that came after her were all based on roughly the same overall design, and as a general rule, the name of the first ship in the class is what the class itself is named after. The Gerald R. Ford is now the lead ship of the updated Gerald R. Ford class, which will slowly replace all of the ships that make up the Nimitz class. However, this first Nimitz class carrier, the Nimitz, has now been in service for over 50 years. In that time, it's seen several modifications to update its systems and perform routine maintenance, the biggest of which came back in 2001. It's a common misconception that since these ships are powered by nuclear reactors, they never need to be refueled. This unfortunately breaks the fundamental laws of physics. Even fissile material can't create energy from nothing. Regular nuclear reactors like those in commercial power stations are refueled every 18 to 24 months. According to the Department of Energy, nuclear naval vessels like aircraft carriers and submarines can extend this cycle by up to about 25 years by using highly enriched weapons-grade uranium. Now, this is actually a bit of a problem because the US officially stopped producing this stuff back in 1992 after signing the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. To get around this, the Department of Energy has taken the fuel out of dismantled nuclear weapons and stored it away to slowly go into these ships as it's required. It should, hopefully, go without saying that this refueling process is done very carefully in the only facility authorized to handle these operations, the Newport News shipyard. When the Nimitz went in for refueling back in 2001, it was pulled apart and rebuilt in a modernization process to keep it in service for another 25 years, which brought it through to today. The ship is now scheduled to finish its final deployment no later than May of next year, at which time it will be handed back over to Newport News shipyard for decommissioning. Given that these ships are filled with top secret weapons systems and nuclear reactors, they can't be scrapped on the beaches of India like most other merchant vessels. The decommissioning and defueling process will take about an additional decade in total, and that's optimistic. For the first 5 years, the Nimitz will be kept here in Dry Dock 11, right next door to the John F. Kennedy that will replace it in 2027, bringing the Navy back up to the mandated 11 carriers. The reactors and engineering systems will be carefully pulled out and discarded before the hull is then towed up to the Naval Inactive Ship Maintenance Facility in Philadelphia to await traditional scrapping. The reason why the decade timeframe for decommissioning is optimistic is because the ship that came before the Nimitz, the former John F. Kennedy, was taken out of service in 2007, and it was only earlier this year that the process of cutting the ship apart for scrap began when she was sold from inventory in the Philadelphia holding yard. This old carrier was sold for 1 single cent to International Shipbreaking Limited to be taken apart in their yard in Brownsville, Texas, about 2 miles from the Mexican border. Now, to be fair, at this point the former carrier was effectively a hollow floating metal box, but it was still filled with tens of millions of dollars worth of scrap metal. The reason why it was sold off for just a single penny is because even when cutting these ships up for their metal, it still needs to be done within the USA, and the USA is simply not a hot destination for most other ship scrapping because the process usually relies on an army of low-paid workers operating with no safety standards and no regard for the local environment. All of this means that, yep, you guessed it, there's only one shipbreaking yard in the world that's authorized to scrap these ships, and it's this one right here in Brownsville, which in turn means there wasn't much competition in the bidding process. In fact, while we were putting together this video, we were actually able to submit a FOIA request to get the classified footage of that auction released.
How much am I bid for item 751? 751. Nothing. No bids for item 751.
$1.
Sold for $1.
Unfortunately, this historically accurate recreation of that event accidentally depicted a price 100 times higher than they really paid, but you get the idea. Today's modern carriers are built with a similar service life in mind. They're taking 20 years to construct, 5 years to refuel, 20 years to fully take apart, with 50 to 60 years of operation in between. What this means is that ashes to ashes, these ships are going to be a major economic commitment for, near as makes no difference, 100 years. This presents a planning challenge because it's a matter of national security that capacity and expertise is always available to build, refuel, service, and decommission these vessels. The problem this represents is that these are not normal ships, and even if they were, regular American shipyards are all but extinct anyway. Private, for-profit companies simply do not operate on centuries-long timeframes. They need regular revenues, and so does their workforce, or they're all going to move to another industry. Between 11 carriers, there's only enough consistent work to keep one shipyard operating continuously. If the government wanted to offer these contracts to a competitor, it would need to prove to investors that a new, highly capital-intensive shipyard was worth investing in, and the only way it would be able to do that is by offering even more contracts to give those investors a reliable return on their investment. In fact, even with just one shipyard, a shipyard that holds a monopoly on this industry, the true financial value of this business is not as clear as you might think. The reason Northrop Grumman spun off and sold the business was because it required such large investments into infrastructure that it simply wasn't worth it to them to keep, which might not make much sense, but think of it like this. This would be kind of like if you had a successful business selling cakes out of your corner store. You made a healthy and reliable profit of around $100,000 a year running your little bakery, but you needed to spend $500,000 on new ovens, and your store itself was worth $5 million. You might have a good business, but it just makes more financial sense to sell up and reinvest that money into something that could make a higher return. In their submission to the SEC before selling off their shipbuilding business, this is effectively what Northrop Grumman said. Today, they are still a major contractor to the carrier program, but they supply far more high-margin and competitive technical components rather than just the big metal box itself. For the current shareholders in Huntington Ingalls Industries, the return on investment is not as high as something like a tech stock, but it's very consistent, a lot like a government bond because, well, it kind of is. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. The Department of Defense should not be concerned with the financial performance of a private company, and you're probably right. But the same kind of economic decision-making happens for the workers as well, when they're choosing to undertake the rigorous training and background checks required to get a job working on these ships. People are happy to go through these hoops for an above-average and consistent paycheck. But if that work consistency can't be guaranteed, then it becomes much harder to maintain this workforce and their highly specialized skills. The US Navy can't go anywhere else to procure their aircraft carriers, but the Newport News shipyard also can't go anywhere else to sell them, so they kind of need each other. Additionally, for what it's worth, Congress does at least pretend to have some negotiating power by simply highlighting that it could just order fewer carriers in total. They have set the law at 11, but that's after they reduced it from 12, and every year they stand over HII and tell them to pray they don't alter the deal further. When Congress was approving the purchase order for the new class of aircraft carriers in the production pipeline, the idea of reducing the number of required carriers to 8 was seriously considered. The floated idea was to substitute the missing 3 supercarriers with 6 light carriers that didn't have nuclear reactors and therefore wouldn't need to be built in the highly specialized Newport News shipyard. The idea was pushed back against heavily by naval leadership, who claimed that their capabilities were already stretched, which of course they always will be because nobody wants their budget cut. Now the thing is, even if this plan did go ahead, it may not have changed the underlying economics much anyway. Even light carriers are still big ships that would be roughly comparable in size to other similar vessels from France, the UK, or Italy. Within the US, there are still only 2 yards that can produce naval ships this big: Newport News in Virginia and the Pascagoula shipyard in Massachusetts, which is also owned by Huntington Ingalls Industries. So even if the Navy did allow their fleet to be reorganized to allow for more negotiating leverage, the shipyards would still be competing against themselves. It's a system that's worked well enough for the last 70 years to not really bother with any major shakeups, but that capacity is once again coming under scrutiny by a new major power that's becoming a legitimate rival, by doing almost absolutely everything differently. Now, the internet doesn't need another armchair admiral, so we won't be assessing their comparative warfighting capabilities, but realistically, China is currently the only major power on Earth that would come close to rivaling the USA on the oceans. So what is interesting is the industrial system they've built up to support their rapidly expanding naval power. China's overall shipbuilding industry is now 200 times larger than the USA's. In just the last 20 years, shipyards like Tianjin on the outskirts of Shanghai have been built from the ground up and are now individually producing more ships than every shipyard in America combined. Now, most of this shipbuilding is commercial freighters and container ships, the kind of merchant vessels that we would usually hyperfixate on this channel. But the thing is, ships are ships, and while a modern aircraft carrier is far more advanced and highly engineered than a container ship, they still require the same general expertise and facilities. Enormous dry docks, modular construction techniques, supply chains, and a large roster of naval workers all support an industry that can crank out more ships than any other country in history. This facility back in Shanghai spends most of its time producing commercial ships for export, but it was also responsible for producing the country's third aircraft carrier, which officially entered service just last month. The irony is that this shipyard, which is primarily producing private vessels, is government-owned under the China State Shipbuilding Corporation, while the Newport News shipyard in America, producing exclusively naval vessels, is privately owned by HII. What this allows China to do is diversify their carrier program across dozens of potential dual-use shipyards, because in the time that these facilities are not building carriers or other warships, they can then just go back to building regular merchant vessels for a profit, giving these yards operational stability that doesn't rely on constant financial life support from the military. China's immense industrial capacity also means that even economically, they're hard to beat. Their merchant ships are now cheaper than their only real rivals in South Korea and Japan. If you ever wanted proof that economics always wins, the Taiwanese shipping company Evergreen currently has several ships under construction in the same shipyard building Chinese warships that they are threatening to use to invade Taiwan. Now, to put things back into perspective, even with this far larger and more flexible shipbuilding capacity, I've done the math here, and 3 carriers is a smaller number than 11 carriers. What's more is that by their own acknowledgement, these Chinese ships do not compete with the American ones, but they're quickly catching up. This latest carrier to come out of China was built in just 7 years, and fully entered service in less than 10. Their first nuclear carrier is predicted to enter service in 2030, and in a protracted conflict with China, could simply outproduce the USA by 10-1. Hopefully this never happens, but it does raise the question of why the USA let itself fall so far behind on shipbuilding in the first place. It's a great question which you can get the answer to by watching this video next. And don't forget to subscribe for more micro stories with big impacts.